I'd like to call to order the City of Lake Forest District 67 Board of Education meeting for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2013. May I have a roll call vote? Madam Clerk.
Mr. Anderson,
Present.
Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Schuler,
Here.
Mrs. Clemenson,
Here.
Mr. Borkowski,
Here.
Mr. Lemke,
Here.
Mr. Folker.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. The first order of business is the President's report. I'm very pleased with the performance so far of our new board members. As a group, they have been really without exception respectful, energetic, ethical, open-minded, and eager to learn. And I commend Mike Simic and his team for devoting substantial time towards making their orientation a success. One of the challenges of serving on a board of education is that there's often substantial disagreement about what the role of the board should be. As anyone familiar with organizational behavior can tell you, it's hard for a group to be effective if there's not substantial buy-in about the nature and scope of the overall mission. These challenges may arise from a number of factors, and everyone may be at some point bear some responsibility. It's clear that two proper roles for a board of education are: one, developing a vision for the district, and two, maintaining oversight of the operations of the district. Importantly, both of these roles can only be performed by the board. The district cannot properly develop a vision on its own, as it is ultimately funded by the community for the education of the community's children. And the district can also not be charged with its own oversight, as there's an obvious conflict of interest. I'd like to speak briefly about each of these areas. Vision. Everyone agrees that this function belongs at the board level. It is through the process of developing a vision that our community's shared values can most effectively be incorporated into our students' education. Do we want to educate students who are competitive internationally in math and science? Do we want to educate students who are responsible citizens who contribute to their communities? Do we want to educate students who are confident enough to take risks and start new companies or other organizations? While it's tempting to answer all of the above to such questions, the relative importance we place on each of them has important implications for the sort of academic curriculum we offer and the values and skills we seek to instill in our students. With a new superintendent and substantial turnover on the board, this is a great time to focus on the mission, vision, and goals of the district. Oversight. Conflict between a board of education and a school district is often related to the oversight function of the board. It'd be very valuable to have a good definition of the oversight role so this function could be as productive and efficient as possible. One important key to understanding the oversight function is the role of policy. In general, the oversight function of the board means that it has a legal responsibility to ensure the district has policies in place which allow the district to successfully carry out its educational mission, to be responsible with public funds, and to ensure there is a means for monitoring and verifying that these policies are followed. The policies should be written, transparent, and clear, and they should be reviewed regularly, and board members should be familiar with them. Responsibility for carrying out these policies is not the job of the board, and board members must refrain from involving themselves in the implementation of policy, as this can undermine the work of district employees. Our district employs highly trained educational professionals who need latitude to do their jobs as they see fit. Similarly, the district must also give the board the needed freedom to perform its legally mandated functions. Based on my experience serving on this board, I'm confident that both the board and administration will act in good faith and are capable of a self-reflective and honest appraisal of their proper roles. I know I speak for all board members in saying that we look forward to working with Mr. Simic and the district to continue building an effective board-district relationship which will serve all of our important constituencies. That concludes the formal part of the President's report. In addition, what we wanted to do this evening was get feedback from board members on the discussion we had at last month's meeting regarding food service. And we actually haven't done this sort of thing before, but we're really going to sort of go down the line, and for people who were here and have anything that they'd like to comment on, I think it'd be a good time to do that. One sort of issue at hand is that it's been 6 years since we've had a new food service provider, and well, I think reasonable people could disagree on this. One thought is that it might be a good time to go ahead and look for someone else to at least rebid the process, the contract for food service. So I'm going to start on the left and ask Mike Borkowski if he has any thoughts on this matter.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for that introduction, as well as the opportunity to do this informal polling of us. We did talk about this at the last Board of Ed meeting, and I'll kind of reiterate my thoughts. I think that 6 years is a long time, and it is time to rebid the service part of the contract. One of the things that I learned at the last board meeting was that we as a district actually define the program versus the food supplier. I didn't quite understand that. So I think equally important, part one is that it is time to rebid simply because it's been a long time. But equally important, I think, is that it's time to have the district, have the community, with the administration's involvement, the board's involvement, the community, the parents' involvement, redefine what the program actually is. Nutrition and the perceived importance of nutrition has really, really come a long way in the past 6 or 7 years. And so taking a fresh look at that, I think, makes a lot of sense. I won't suggest at all the solution, but I think that the community, at least from what I hear, there is at least two factions. There is a faction of people that want really good, healthy, high-quality food, and I think they probably are willing to pay something for it. And there may be another percentage of people that are much more price conscious. As we hopefully do go and redefine this, I would just throw out there to consider maybe there's two options. Maybe there is a higher priced, healthier option and a lower priced, okay option. I don't know. That's getting into the details, but I wholeheartedly support the idea of a rebid as well as a redefine of the program. Thanks for asking.
Thank you, Mike. And let me make clear to board members and the audience that we're not going to vote at the end of this. This is really just to give folks a sense of where the board stands on this. Ms. Fisher.
I would like to say first, Mike had shared that a little earlier, just thoughts on his own about the two options in food service options, perhaps on a daily basis. I had never thought about that. I think it is an interesting concept because I do think there are two camps of people. And not speaking for Quest because they are not here, but based upon what happened last month in their presentation, Jen Hermes' presentation, and then with Quest speaking as well, they seem very amenable to working with us. And I think that's something we could perhaps suggest if this discussion continues. So that's something I think that we need to keep in mind is Mike's suggestion. I had felt before the presentation last month, based upon 6 years with the same food service, that perhaps this was the time for a rebidding. I don't know that I feel very confident in that anymore. What I do feel confident in is that it was an enlightening presentation last month. I think Quest, as I said before, amenable to working with us. I think they would be great to work with now that we recognize that the board and the district really have the onus on having strong participation here. We need to take responsibility as a board, I feel, and work alongside Quest and Jen Hermes and Ann Whipple with Quest, because again, I feel that they are very willing to work with us. What resonated strongly with me is that they are very sensitive to children with allergies, which can be a life and death situation, which is of the utmost of importance. I also feel that nutrition has come a long way, and that many people that I talk to on a daily basis want the nutritional values to go along with the high educational values that we have for our children. There are many studies that will say that there is a direct correlation between what you put in your body and what comes into your mind and then what goes out of your mind. So if we are truly educating the whole child, we've got to be very focused on what that is. And one of the services that Quest talked about was that they do have a nutritionist on staff. That part of our contract, we could work alongside them, which was very attractive to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Jeff.
My takeaways from the last meeting relative to the food service discussion was twofold. One, I'm pleased with Quest and the work that they've done and the people they've had on our account and how they've managed our district and the customer service they've provided and the way they've listened. That being said, in our role on the board, it makes sense for us to follow policy relative to how long a contract should be allowed to go before it is rebid as part of the financial stewards of the district's money. So with that in mind, I wholeheartedly support some type of a process to re-examine the costs and the relationship with any supplier that goes beyond a certain period of time. In fact, I would suggest as a part of the policy committee, we figure out a way to get that into policy in general, because I think that's something we should be doing anyway. Whether they're good or not isn't the issue. It's making sure that we're following policy and that we're establishing a policy that helps us maintain the financial stewardship. The second thing, though, is I do support the idea of having a community committee to help provide that direction with Jen and administrative participation, board participation, and community participation, because I think that's what's going to help get to the best solution. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Rob?
Thanks, Bill. I would agree with most everything that's been said, especially with Leslie's comments. I feel like we have to respect the fact that the district seems very, very happy with this. But we also then have to understand that it's been 6 years. So I would be in full favor of, using Jeff's word, re-examine it next year. Whether that's rebidding, whether that's we putting together a committee and seeing what kind of food served at Gurnee and Skokie and wherever else we might want to go. I don't know if $3 is high. I don't know if $3 is low. I don't know if the amount of fresh fruit we serve is high. I don't know if it's low. So I think we need more information. If that's a rebid, that's a rebid. And if it's a different kind of examination, that's fine with me as well.
Thank you. Beth?
Well, I like the way some of the other board members sort of separated it into two key issues. I think first and foremost, it's probably time to re-examine what we're really looking for from our food service provider. Because whether it's Quest or anyone else, we want to be one voice in terms of our direction to them. So I think that, 6 years is a long time. A lot has changed. I love what Leslie said about, the correlation between what we put in our bodies and what comes out of our minds. And there is, I think, a large faction in the community that feels that we are a high-quality school district, and therefore having high-quality foods should be one of our pillars. I don't know if that's a vocal minority or the majority, and we should find that out. So I love the idea of kind of strategically looking at this. Then sort of separately from a business standpoint, I do think reevaluating all core suppliers on an ongoing basis, whether that's at 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, I'm not sure what the right time is. Perhaps now is the right time. And that doesn't mean you make a change. That doesn't mean that you, because if you're perfectly happy and there's nothing better out there, you stay with who you have. But going through the process of rebidding probably makes sense after 6 years.
Thank you. Rick?
I agree with the consensus. I see a lot more upside and very little downside to getting a new bidding process. And I, too, would break it out into two categories. One, potentially cost savings, and equally as important, maybe just new, fresh ideas. I'm not so sure about two cost options. Don't mean to pick on Mike, but I think we should have all our kids eat the quality food. But I'm just open. I'm just kidding. I'm just open to new ideas. We don't know a lot about it. Like Rob said, we don't know if $3.50 is competitive or not. We don't know how the quality stacks up. So, presentation and hearing more about it can only lead to good changes.
Thank you. And for myself, I'll just add also, I think 6 years is a long time. One of the things we do real well in our district is develop new ideas and develop things. A potential weakness is sometimes we can be too insular. And as Beth pointed out, this is a field that's developing rapidly, and I don't see how it can hurt too much to look outside more. I also think that food service is closely linked to education. It's different than some other outside services that or things that we outsource, because it ties into the curriculum and ties into what we're trying to model for our kids. I agree also with what was said, that we need to take responsibility for the food program ourselves. It's only going to be as good as we demand and as we request. And I also acknowledge that there's opportunity costs anytime you do something like this. We have a terrific staff, but they can only do so many things, and so we do have a lot of initiatives going. But all that said, I think, in my view, it would be a good year to look outside at other options, and we might end up in the same place, but it would still be better off for doing that. I would ask the superintendent if he has something to chime in as well.
If I might defer to Mr. Albus, if you have anything, because this would fall under your area of responsibility with Jen Hermes not being here. It comes to you. Yeah, you're not a Boy Scout, so she's not with you here tonight. She's in West Virginia on a scouting expedition with the Scouts, and so I don't know if you have anything that you care to add.
I'm not sure I want to, because some of it may be in conflict with some of the things that have been said. You know, the school code addresses bidding and contracting. And in the school code, there's probably 15 or 16 different exceptions to when you go out to bid. One of the exceptions is when the service that you're acquiring demands a high degree of skill on the part of the person or the company. That's why attorneys, that's why accountants are not required to be bid, because they would fall under that exception. Because of the way we run food service, our food service could fall under that exception as well. So the thing I think that's being risked here is, and I've worked in numerous systems, is that Quest has been very responsive. And one of the things I personally like about Quest is that they are a niche company. They do not go after every bid that's out there. They try to find things that are a good match for them, and they try to be responsive. I have worked in systems that have had larger contractors where I think there's less flexibility. So I think what's being put at risk would be the management level of service that we get, which we know to be excellent. The cost of the program is the cost of the food. We set the labor, we buy the product, and then the management is $50,000 on top of that. So we might be able to go out and save some money. But then again, you're weighing the, if we save 10% on $50,000 versus the level of management service that we get. I have a fear that we're going to go through this process, and the process is not going to result in everybody being on a uniform page. There are very divergent opinions on what food service should be, and simply changing out the management company, I don't think is going to change that. What that program should be, there are a lot of ways I think that could be attacked. There are resources within the community that could be drawn upon and work in conjunction with Quest. I guess I'll end it with an example. And I've heard some comments. Generally, yes, a lot of times you do go out and bid every 4 or 5 years. That does make sense, but not always. And the example I'll use would be attorneys. We could go out every 5 years, find a cheaper attorney. But the trade-off is that cultural knowledge and the history that you build with professionals. And I think some of that exists in this situation as well. So I think I'm running a little contrary to where some of the opinions are. I just ask you to keep
That's okay.
in mind what we would be putting at risk. And that's not to say Quest is the only good company out there. There are others, but there are others out there that are problematic. The reason we went to Quest is we had a company in here that generally is a very good company, Aramark, but we had very bad management at the time, and that led to a change. There are other companies that are out there that have gotten into lawsuits and conflicts with school districts. So that's what we're putting at risk from my view.
Bill, can I add that you made a good point. The trick will be keeping the opportunity cost down and not taking too much time with this. But what we are saying is relooking at it doesn't necessarily mean there will be a change. But it might spark some new creativity and ideas and looking at the costs from Quest as well as some other companies might have some good ideas. But we have to keep this manageable. That's a good point. We can't make this, take an inordinate amount of time to save $5,000.
Alan, can I ask two questions?
$25,000 of opportunity costs and time.
Two questions. Just for my own clarification, if we rebid, is it a state mandate or some type of mandate that we have to go with the lowest bidder, or do we have professional judgment that past experience and general management can be taken into account when you make the decision?
I would want to check on that. In most food service bid criteria, you set up a matrix, you have a committee, you do site visits, and it's a very regulated process. We have a little more latitude because of the way our program is run. So I wouldn't call it a bid. I would call it maybe a request for proposals. The danger there, though, if somebody doesn't think you're serious about making a change, then they're not going to be serious about making a proposal.
And the second question, you addressed the bidding part of what we talked about. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the sort of the redefining or re-examining the food program, what we're asking for of this service provider. Thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things Mr. McTaggart talked about when he was here at the meeting, and I've heard him talk about it several times before, and I forget the name of the school. Maybe somebody can help me, but there's a magnet school, I believe, in Chicago. That Latin school. But he said, come down and see what we're doing there, because they've defined the program. Now, the problem is, I believe the cost of the lunches was $7 or something a day.
13, I think.
Okay, so, it's finding that balance there. So I don't, in my mind, I don't think it's a question of whether Quest can deliver. I think they can deliver. It's a matter of defining what we want. And as long as we're trying to cover the entire spectrum, I think we're always going to fail, because the spectrum is too big on this issue. So I think we've got to define what we want to do and recognize that some people may choose not to avail themselves of that service.
I think so many good ideas have been generated just in this small amount of time tonight. Thank you, Bill, for allowing us to talk about it and asking our opinions. Thank you, Alan, for answering that. As I go down the row of everyone who suggested something, whether it's Mike's options and meal plans, or Rob, I think, was the first person who used the term re-examine instead of necessarily rebid, if I'm incorrect. Oh, who was that? Jeff? Okay, whoever it was, I'm giving credit. I really think what we know, if we're talking about, let's say, a committee, and I know we're not deciding this right now, but if we want to go ahead and perhaps re-examine, I think the only minus that I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that rebidding, per se, rebidding, would be an enormous amount of time on the administration's part. That's correct, right?
It would, but that's not a reason not to do it.
Correct.
The bigger reason, I think, is the risk of losing something that is
already good. But if we could we can always rebid, correct? So, but if we go through a process of re-examination perhaps first, as a precursor to this, and talk about, we suggested maybe committees with schools. We already have food service liaisons as APT representatives that we could target from each building who are already there in that role to work with board oversight and working together as we are supposed to. Maybe that's something to look into.
Thanks to everyone for their comments. Much appreciated. Alan as well. Thank you. That concludes the President's report. The next item on the agenda is the Superintendent's report. Mr. Simic.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity here. I wanted to tag on to something that Mr. Anderson said related to his impressions of our new board members and an update to the community on that. I've found them to be people of goodwill, that they are smart and open and honest and flexible in their thinking, which are all key characteristics. One of the things that Mr. Anderson mentioned was the orientation that the board members have been participating in, and it's a really significant amount of time that is not seen by the public, and it's a lot of reading. The policy manual alone of the district is about 2 inches thick, and I know that at least one of them, I would say safely 4 of them probably have read it cover to cover, and it is not the most engaging reading that you might ever do. But it is very important because the school board governs through its policies, and they're working very diligently on that. The orientation also entails Saturdays, that entails evenings. Being on the board, part of being on the board is that a visit to the grocery store is never like it used to be again. There are also meetings and committee meetings and board meetings, and above all else, I think, is the responsibility. These folks are responsible for both the people, the children in this case, and the organizations that people in every community care about greatly. And I would say without question that the schools are one of the most important civic organizations, and that our school board members are elected officials. People sometimes think of them as volunteers. In my experience in going to Washington to visit senators and Congress people, is that they interact with school board members in a very, very different way than they do an individual member of the public, because they are trustees of the community and are responsible for large and important things, tax levies and so on, but also most significantly the education of the thing that people in the community care the most about, and that's the community's children. So thank you to all of our new board members and the work that you're doing, and our new board leadership as well, and their diligence and hard work in that. Importantly, part of the work of the charge of the last board was to charge me with succession planning and hiring important positions, and we've had a significant amount of change both at the board level and also within our administration, and I have 2 really key folks I'd like to say officially welcome to. One is Lauren Fagel, who comes to us with a very impressive background. One of the unusual things in conducting pretty extensive background search calls on Mrs. Fagel was that the more people I talked to, the more impressed I was that we were able to secure her for a position here. It's very unusual to have phone call after phone call have somebody say, wow, that is really a good hire. And even when we were speaking on a different issue, people would pull away from that issue and say, hey, I heard that you hired Lauren Fagel. That's a really good move, Mike. And so we are in a position where we are stealing from our surrounding communities their best and brightest. And another one of those best and brightest is Dr. Lori Wilcox. Similar reviews from Mrs. Wilcox. One of our community members has extensive experience with Mrs. Wilcox, or Dr. Wilcox, excuse me. And that person on a background check said, hands down, one of the very best decisions I ever made was to hire Dr. Wilcox, and your organization that will serve his children in this case is really, really fortunate to have her. And that was another emphatic message across the background check. So welcome, and we really look forward to the work. Even though Dr. Wilcox is officially only in 67, she will be at the cabinet table with everyone else, and I think a significant contributor across 67 and 115, very importantly. And Mrs. Fagel is shared service. To be clear, she's 115 and 67 in a new and different position with, I think, probably the longest title in the state. Curriculum, instruction, technology, and assessment. And it encompasses a lot, and it's all important. So to both of you, thank you for coming and being so excited about the work. Really impressed with the questions you've already asked, and it's only been a few days, so welcome.
Well, don't go too fast. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the board on any matter of their choosing or interest? Mr. Gray? Seeing none. We move to reports and discussions. Mr. Simic.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. So reports and discussions, we have no reports for this month, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. We now move to board committee reports, the first being the Education Committee. Leslie Fisher.
The Education Committee has not met since our last board meeting. We are scheduled to meet for the first time this year, September 17th at 8:15 in the morning, right here at West Campus, where myself, Jeff Volker, and Beth Clemenson will represent the board on the Education Committee. And we have completed the selection process for the community members who will be joining our committee in the fall, and they are Sridhar Krishnaswamy and Lorraine Grieve, and we are excited to welcome them in. We think they will be very, very positive additions to our board and to the discussion that should follow. And we want to thank both Amy Lazzarato and Roger Kwan for their service the past 2 years on our committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. The next committee is Finance and Operations. Rick Schuler.
Thank you, Bill. The Finance and Operations Committee did meet last week, July 17th. Present were Bill Anderson, myself, Rob Lemke, Mike Borkowski, Alan Albus, Jennifer Hermes, Carol White, and Brittany Schramm. The meeting was short on topics but long on discussion. The first item staff presented with was a discussion about benchmarking expenses with our comparable communities. And in sum, I would say that it was clear that our expenses are in line with our comps, if not slightly below. Salaries were a little bit below, offset a little bit by third-party expenses, and that's due strictly to the shared services setup between the two districts. The second item was, it was pointed out by staff that the district belongs to a healthcare insurance cooperative. The benefits of this cooperative are, one, better purchasing power, and two, shared resources when it comes to looking at things like healthcare reform. The third item, and by far the biggest item, we looked at the 2014 budget. First off, the school code requires that the tentative budget must be on display to the public for 30 days. A notice must be published in the newspaper, and we must conduct a public hearing. Also, the budget must be adopted by the end of the first quarter, meaning September, the end of the first quarter being September 30th. Hence, now is the time that staff is going through the budget diligently. In sum, the group reviewed the budget for 2014, which we're pleased to say is actually a slight positive surplus. Details of the budget are here for everybody to see, but I'll just go over a summary of the numbers. Projected revenue and other finance sources for the upcoming year are budgeted to total approximately $35 million. There's also debt services, which includes some items that offset each other, but that adds another $2 million for a total funds of $37 million. Projected expenditures and other financing uses are projected to total roughly $34 million, leaving a positive surplus for the year. There are two primary reasons for the surplus for this coming year. Number one, as I think most of us are aware, the state has not yet passed legislature regarding pension reform. That pension reform would pass a percentage of the pension costs from the state level to the community level. We all expect that to happen, but nobody knows for sure when. Importantly, Alan and Jennifer continue to make that part of the budget, and if I'm not wrong, Alan, it starts next year, phasing in at what % a year?
We did not include it in the FY14 budget, but in the 5-year projection, because conventional wisdom right now is that it is going to occur. And I'll talk about that in some detail too.
When I say next year, I actually mean starting in the 2015 budget, not this upcoming 2014 budget. The other reason for the cost savings versus what we might have projected a year ago is the continuing declining enrollment in our district. All we can look at really is past history. I'm not sure exactly how many years enrollment's been declining, but it's been 3 or 4. Does that seem about right? And unfortunately, there's no magic to predicting going forward other than extrapolating from recent history. I think it's fair to say that that's what Alan and Jennifer do, is continue to extrapolate sort of on a straight line basis. And all we can really do is adjust as things change. It's very difficult to project that actual inflection point. But that would be the second reason for continued savings. We also spent a lot of time talking about the 5-year budget and items such as debt service and capital expenditures and how they get incorporated not just in the short-term 1-year budget, but a 5-year budget and beyond. Especially with capital expenditures, it's an item that can be not even neglected, but pushed off to the future, and it can skew a longer-term budget, or it can skew a shorter-term budget, but in the long run, it has to be accounted for in a longer budget. And I think everybody in the committee was satisfied as of now that those items, excuse me, are being looked at and accounted for. We also spent some time talking about prioritizing capital expenditures that, capital expenditures that we all agree need to be done, and then prioritizing sort of a wish list as opposed to needs. All that is a big part of the 5-year budget. On balance, I think I'm getting too much into the 5-year budget, but it was really a lot of our time. I think it's fair to say at this point that the 5-year budget is pretty much in balance without a surplus or a deficit. But we do expect at this time a surplus for the 2014 fiscal year. Next meeting, or future meetings rather, we agreed on 8 o'clock on a Tuesday or a Thursday to accommodate as many people as possible. And lastly, it wasn't discussed until the end, we are interviewing, or we're looking at resumes for applicants from the community to join our committee. A lot of people on the board are helping me, in addition to some of the staff, in looking at these resumes. We're going to try to boil it down to a smaller subset and have some interviews, and I would say by September 30th have 2 community members join our committee.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thanks as always, Alan, for great work on the budget and projections and everything. Really remarkable. The next committee report is the Policy Committee. Mike Borkowski.
Thank you. The Board Policy Committee met on July 18th at 9:30 a.m. last week. Present at the meeting were Jeff Folker, Bill Anderson, Mike Semick, Andy Hendrickson, Lauren Fagel, Jen Hermes, and myself. This was the first time the Board Policy Committee had met in quite some time, and both committee members were new to it, so the meeting began with an overview of the committee purpose, process, and structure. The Policy Committee hopes to support and empower the Board of Education in its efforts to govern appropriately and effectively. The committee will be reviewing and discussing policy revisions which are brought to the committee by press and other governmental agencies, as well as issues raised by any board members, administrator, or others. The committee will also begin systematic review of the board policy manual. In general, the committee's process will include discussing the pros and cons of any policy under consideration, and all interested parties are invited to participate in these discussions. The committee hopes to bring the best thinking of the committee to the Board of Education for formal votes. After this introduction was completed, the committee began a review of Section 2.150, which lists the standing committees. Currently, this section includes little, if any, explanation of the vision and/or purpose of some of the main committees listed. So an action item was noted for the Policy Committee to review any existing information that may exist in this regard, such as the committee charter documents that exist, and if necessary, to develop a template for the committee chairs to use to articulate the purpose of each committee. So Leslie and Rick, you may see more on that coming up. The Policy Committee then discussed the Parent-Teacher Advisory Committee and the Behavioral Interventions Committee, neither of which we believe are active committees in our district, but both of which are listed as standing committees. After additional research, we determined these committees are state-mandated committees. The reactivation of committees does not fall under the scope of the Policy Committee, so we pass this item to Mr. Anderson and Mr. Semick, the Board President and Superintendent, for their implementation. The committee next discussed two policy updates which will come up for a vote before the Board of Education later in our meeting tonight. The first was the creation of an audit committee as a standing committee. Numerous benefits of this committee were discussed, including that financial oversight is a core and critical function of the Board of Education, and that creating a deeper independent relationship with the external auditors would be viewed as valuable by board members and the community in general. A concern was raised that the auditors already provide an annual update to the Finance Committee. The desired mission of the Audit Committee would be to have a deeper and more independent relationship with the auditors than exists under the current structure. The second policy update under discussion, and that'll be brought up for vote later tonight, was adding a Compensation Committee, also as a standing committee listed in Section 2.150. The purpose of the Compensation Committee would be to define the philosophy under which the administration would set wages, for example, determining salary bands, as well as to discuss any specific compensated related issues which may arise. The committee would have a significant research function. A concern was raised regarding the committee treading into day-to-day operations, but we discussed this, and this clearly is not the purpose of the committee. It was noted that much of the work that potentially would be required from the administration for this committee is already being accomplished, so this committee should not require significant additional resources from the administration. An additional important concern was raised by a committee member regarding the creation of both of these committees. This concern was that the financial oversight function and defining the compensation philosophy are both important functions for every board member to participate in, not just for a few committee members. A discussion ensued regarding if all Board of Education members are indeed permitted to attend all committee members, are allowed to attend all committee meetings without violating the Open Meetings Act or causing a committee meeting to become a full board meeting. An action item was taken to discuss this with the board's legal counsel to understand if this was or was not allowed. At the conclusion of these discussions, the best thinking of the Policy Committee is currently to bring the creation of both the Audit Committee and the Compensation Committee to the full Board of Ed for a full vote, and this will occur later tonight. The Policy Committee also discussed the need to update names and titles listed in certain sections of the policy manual, which has been created by recent retirements. The board clerk has taken the action item to update these sections with the appropriate names. The Policy Committee meeting adjourned at 11:45 a.m. After the meeting adjourned, a conference call was held with Mike Hernandez, the board's legal counsel. During this conversation, the following items were clarified, which impacts everyone on this board. Each subcommittee of the board is subject to OMA rules, Open Meetings Act rules, including that agendas must be posted 48 hours in advance and meeting minutes must be taken. This is true even if the committee is made up of only 2 board members and those 2 board members meet to discuss committee work. Committee meetings should be held on district property. Any and all board members are permitted to attend all committee meetings, and they may fully participate in these discussions, meaning all 7 of us can go to every committee meeting. However, when it's time for the committee to formally do its work, for example, formally make a recommendation or take a type of vote, the committee does its work as a committee of the 2 or 3 board members who are actually on the committee, not as the entire Board of Education. It's always important that the committee chair ensure that the discussions are aligned with the agenda items and that the committee does not appear to be taking board action This becomes even more important when additional board members are present at committee meetings. But it's important to note to the inclusion item that all of us can go to committee meetings and participate in those discussions. A committee may not take formal board action. Public participation time must always be included at committee meetings as well as board meetings. At a minimum, a defined public participation item must be present on the agenda, but importantly, there is no maximum threshold for public participation. The discretion of how much public participation is held by the committee chair and the committee members. There's also no maximum threshold for meeting minutes. As much detail as is desired is always permitted. Lastly, Mike Hernandez reminded us that attorney review is strongly encouraged for any policy revisions, particularly those related to wages, hours, or working conditions. Utilizing press or IASB is good for policies that have been passed by the legislature. But any local rules, we definitely would want attorney review. The next policy committee meeting is targeted for early September, and that concludes the policy committee report. I would ask if Jeff Folker has anything to add, or there's any questions from board members or the public. That's very much welcome.
Mike, could you just clarify what press is for folks who may not be familiar with that term?
I'm not sure what it stands for. Eileen may tell us, but it's policies that are sent to us via the administration that come either from the IASB or the state legislature. It's
So relative to policy development and management, while we have full oversight, we do utilize the IASB to provide us with direction, recommendations to help us develop policy that is in alignment with legal changes and so forth. Okay. I just thought it'd be helpful for folks to understand that.
And Eileen, for my own clarification, tell me if I got this right. Certain items that are passed to us from press, IASB, may be state mandated things that we really don't have a choice, but they also may pass to us recommendations or suggestions that we do have a choice. Is that right?
Yes, they, like 2 or 3 times a year, will send a packet of policies that need to be looked at. The administration looks at them, makes their recommendations, and basically they are like yes or no situations. You can say no to any of the changes that they propose, or you can include, and sometimes they give various ideas of what you might want to, wording that you might want to use, and you can choose whichever wording you want to put in those policies. But it's usually only about 2 or 3 times a year. I believe there's another one, we have one at the moment that is going through, the administration's looking at, and I believe there will be another one in September when the legislature has changed some of the policies.
One other thing I wanted to add is that we also agreed to work with District 115 across those policies that make sense to have commonality and alignment for the administration. So we'll have a meeting in September to work with the joint policy committees to ensure that we're not going down a path that's going to create problems for the administration relative to how 115 may do something.
And that has been the policy in the past, that we have a joint meeting when we get something from press, from IASB, because they're generally, correlated.
Mike, just a clarification, it came up, can you tell us the number of members that would be on these 2 proposed committees, the audit and compensation?
You're asking me the number that should be on them? We didn't define that in the policy committee, and I'm not sure if that is the policy committee's role to do. It may,
Okay.
I would almost defer to you as the president to.
I think our committees basically have 2 members except for finance and education, which have 3. So we'd probably continue with that. Would be my
Yes,
thought.
and our board policy manual dictates that we may not have more than 3, but you could determine 2 or 3.
Mike, you mentioned that the advisory committee and the behavioral and interventions committee were both mandated by the state. Are either of these other 2 committees also mandated, and kind of what are best practices across other districts regarding these 2 committees?
To my knowledge, they're not state mandated. I could be wrong, but I don't know that. In terms of best practices, I did some research looking, and you find a wide smattering of, some districts have it, some districts don't. some districts that don't have it included in their finance committee, both the audit function and the compensation discussions. Some do it separately. So I didn't find a best practice defined that I truly felt was the best practice.
Leslie?
A lot of new information here that you're presenting. Thank you very much. You mentioned something in there, 48 hours. Is that a posting of an agenda prior to Education and Finance Committee meetings and audit and compensation?
Yes, it's a minimum 48 hours, certainly can do more, but a minimum 48 hours of posting of the agenda is required to be in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. Mike Hernandez, we call our committees, and he points out from a legal perspective, they are actually legally, technically, subcommittees of the board. So when a committee meeting is happening, in his parlance, it's really a subcommittee of the board is meeting, and so all the Open Meetings Act rules need to be followed.
Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much for that report. We now come to liaison reports. These are organizations where a member of the board serves as liaison. Not to give Mike any rest, the first one is NSSED. Mr. Mike Borkowski.
This one's shorter. The NSSED Governing Board has not met since our last Board of Education meeting. The next meeting is scheduled for August 29th. Since our last meeting, I did meet with Julie Cooley in order to understand District 67 matters related to NSSED, including learning the history of NSSED cost structure related to District 67 and to what extent our district actually utilizes the NSSED services. I plan to also meet with Dr. Jean Sophie, Superintendent of Lake Bluff School District 65, and my counterpart at District 115 board in the near future to understand common priorities and how we best might work together. That concludes the NSSED board liaison report. Mike, do you know who my counterpart is on 115?
That would be Mr. Moorman.
Thank
And
you.
I'm happy to take any other questions from board members or the audience.
Hearing none. The next report is Ed Red from myself. There is no report this month. The next report is Curriculum Coordinating Committee, Leslie Fisher.
The Curriculum Coordinating Committee has not met in the past month.
The next report is Spirit of 67 Foundation, Leslie Fisher.
While the Spirit of 67 Foundation has not met in the past month, they are busy at work. The first meeting is going to occur for the entire board September 10th, 9 a.m., right here in this very room. And Laura Werner and Whitney Keller are co-chairing the fall luncheon, which will occur at Exmoor Country Club on October 18th. The event goes from 10 to 2. If you haven't attended in the past, I would encourage you to do so. Not only is it a wonderful afternoon in a beautiful setting with delicious food and great people, but a lot of our grants are on display, and it's a great opportunity to see what the Spirit of 67 funds go to. Thank you. That concludes the Spirit of 67 report.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. We now move to...
Excuse me one moment. Just back on board committees, the JSSE, the Joint Shared Service Committee, or Subcommittee, however we're going to call it from now on, that would be the JSSC, is scheduled to meet August 19th at 7 a.m. here at West Campus.
All right. Thank you. We now move to action items, and the first one is approval of resolution to display the tentative budget. May I have a motion? Or is there discussion of this? Mr. Albus.
Thank you. Mr. Schuler's Finance Committee report was very detailed, so a lot of what I'll be going through is somewhat repetitive, but I'll try and vary it up a little bit here and drill down on a couple of other areas as well. The action item tonight is to place the tentative FY14 budget on display, but before we get to that point, I'd like to start with where we ended FY13, then talk about our budgeting process a little bit. as you can see what's showing up there, the partial sheet that's showing up there, the budget for revenues for FY13 was $37.1 million. And the actual revenue received adjusted for early taxes was 37.3 or close to 37.4 million, for a variance of about $224,000. We're proud of that because that's less than a 1% variance. And given timing of state revenues, interest rates, fee revenues that vary, we're very content with that. And also to be slightly conservative on the revenue side, very comfortable. When we slide over and look at the expenditure side, we had a budget of $38.8 million of expenses, and we came in at $38.5 million of expenses. So again, slightly below, about 1% low on the expense side. Now this can vary from year to year. This was a good year in the sense that revenue came in slightly above what we projected and expenses came in slightly below. There are years where one will be over, one will be under, and you end up about where you thought you were gonna. But as you can see, the actual revenue over, or in this case, under expenses, we actually spent $1.1 million more than we took in large part because of things we talked about last year. We took on the cube construction. We worked with the city and did an early payoff on the IMRF early retirement program that had been implemented. So we knew there were some extraordinary things that were going to hit. But overall, very happy with where the budget came out. And that's relevant here because the budget development is a process that involves months of work. There's input from various departments and a variety of budgeting techniques that are utilized. So for example, and we talked about this last week at our committee meeting, salaries, benefits, capital projects are all approached from a zero-based budgeting perspective. In other words, we start from scratch each year and we build the salary budget based on individual names, individual positions, hours worked, rates of pay. And even doing that, going down to that detail, there is still some variety that occurs because you can have long-term illnesses, sub-costs that come in, professional development or growth, salary credits that occur. So in that case, we might utilize historical trends, but we really break it down to the individual basis there. When it comes to capital projects, those two are broken down on an individual basis. And when you add those items up, that's the bulk of your expenditure budget. Other areas of the budget will utilize historical trends. For example, the operations and maintenance repair budget, we'll tend to look at a 3-year history on that, and if we see a trend, we'll follow it. If we see an anomaly in there where one year is extremely high or extremely low, we'll try to drill down on that and figure out why, and then make some adjustments. Still other areas will use historical trends and projections, and a good example there might be attorney fees. We can look at the trend over several years, but if we know we're going into a year where we're involved in litigation or we're in a contract year, we know we're going to have increased costs, so we'll make an adjustment there. Utility costs are similar. We'll look at trends, but we'll also look back on the prior year. Was it a mild winter, a harsh winter? And then what are the projections going forward? So all these are building blocks for the budget, and it is a several-month process to slowly go in one at a time and build these. And then when we finish that and we compile our first draft, we then take that and compare it to our 5-year projection and see where we have significant variances. And where we do have variances, then we drill down there and try to figure out why. And sometimes we say, okay, we need to make a change in the 5-year, or sometimes we'll catch something that we missed in the first draft of the budget. That check and balance process, plus the team that you now have in the district, Jennifer and I have worked together over 15 years. Katie Laboon, who is just meticulous, brings a fresh set of eyes and perspective, and then the addition of Brittany Schramm. So we're all looking at things from a little bit different perspective and then collectively working on it. So we have a high degree of confidence in the budgets that we produce. Now again, several years ago when interest rates crashed and the state stopped paying, we missed, and those things can happen. It's a little bit like predicting the weather. But if you use good data and good processes, most of the time you'll come out okay. So having said that, I'm going to move on to the FY14 budget, and as you will see, revenues exceed expenditures, in this case by about $1.3 million. Now there are, just as last year where we spent more than we took in because of a couple things, there are a couple of situations that are contributing to us being in the black by $1.3 million this year. For example, earlier this spring, we recommended to the board that we reject bids for asbestos tile abatement and carpet replacement. Well, that was a pretty significant cost. It was a couple $100,000. But that work will occur in future years. So it didn't go away. It's just we delayed the work because we want to come at it a different way. And so that'll have an impact on this coming year's expenditures. We did anticipate the state beginning to transfer pension costs, but the state legislature failed to act on that in May. So the conventional wisdom at the moment is that is likely still to occur, but not likely to occur for the FY14 budget. So we have kept it in our 5-year financial projection, starting, as Mr. Schuler said, in FY15, but we have backed it out of this coming budget. Both of those things are kind of one items. As I said, you can look at that and get a false sense of security about where we're at. We will incur some costs down the road on the abatement. We are likely to incur costs on the pensions. The one I'm not so sure of is built into this budget is a reduction of about 7.42 FTE due to enrollment and administrative changes. And time will tell if that is an anomaly or if that's a new trend. We know the housing market, or at least from the feedback we get, is that certain levels of the housing market are certainly picking up. Now what we need to see is that going to bring in new kids? And if that does, have we hit a bottom to where we'll be flat, or are we going to start seeing an uptick? And so that's the type of things that we continually try and monitor and take feedback on and then incorporate into our long-term projections. One other thing that will be coming down the road is that every 10 years, school districts are required to have their architect conduct what's called a life safety survey. The Illinois Life Safety Code came out of the Our Lady of Angels fire. I think that was back in the 1950s, in which students at a residential school died in a fire where they were housed in a wooden structure. So it's a pretty stringent code, and so every 10 years an architect comes in, goes through your building, looks to where your building is no longer in code compliance, and then you have 3 years to remedy those situations. That will have an impact on our 5-year projection going forward, but at this stage, we can't tell you what that impact will be. So again, to summarize, last year we spent $1.1 million more than we took in, and we knew that was going to happen. This year, we're going to be in the black because of delays on some things and the fact that we're down in FTE. But looking forward, we are still looking at pension costs on the horizon, increased capital costs, because the tile and carpet abatement I talked about, while this year was several $100,000, throughout the district, we're looking at well over $1 million. And the reason we're doing that is because in Project 2000, a lot of new carpet was put down in the schools. That carpet was put on top of asbestos tile, which was very common in schools to do. But as that carpet starts to wear out, we're now faced with doing an abatement, because when you pull the carpet up, you're going to be pulling tiles up. And once you do that and you expose the mastic or the tile, you have a friable situation. Overall, though, I would say we're in a good position to plan. We know we have some expenditures coming down the road, but I believe we're going to have the resources to address those and move forward. I'm going to retire the phrase path to black after tonight, because I've used it a lot over the last few years. It was a little bit easier in 67 because we continued to have attrition in retirements than it was at the high school. But barring a major change from the state, I think we have weathered the storm economically and really made the adjustments we needed to the new revenue stream. So with that, as Mr. Schuler said, there is a process to adopting a budget. It has to be on display for 30 days. In our case, it'll be more like 60 because we don't have the August meeting. We must conduct a public hearing prior to the adoption of the budget, which is an opportunity for the public to comment on components of the budget. Up until the time that you take your final vote on the budget, you have the latitude to change the figures that are in it. So again, we feel very comfortable with it. Overall, I will show one other sheet. And it really illustrates the change in the capital equipment and being down on the FTEs. You can see our expenditures year over year are down 4.8%. Our salaries are relatively flat, even though by contract people will be getting raises. But because of attrition, retirements, and the reduction in staff, it flattens that out significantly.
Thank you for your explanation, both visually and auditorily. As far as the budget being posted, it is posted on our website, correct?
I know the final is, but there's no, I can't remember the statute if the tentative should be, but there's no reason not to post it, so we can make sure it is.
What we see here is accessible to any community member if they go to the board website. So the information that our board members see is exactly what the public sees if it is in their packet, with the exception of the HR report. So this is a change that was instituted, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago. I'm not sure, Mrs. Fowler, if you know. When did we change when did we start to put the same, to have the public website reflect the same as the board website? When was that? April? Okay.
So the public would go under board and under, how do they, just so they know how to access the budget?
I will point out one other thing. There is an official state form that I have in my hand and that you all will sign at some point, which is what we have to officially put on display. So we will put this on display, as well as, if you went into the board packet, a book that looks like this. The reason we do the supplemental book is it at least provides some comparative budget data from last year to this year. The state form does not do that, and the state form is not the easiest form to read.
I don't think that tentative budget, this book, it was not part of our board packet, so I'm not sure if it still is actually accessible.
Okay. We can post it, though, either way. It's a good idea.
Sorry,
It's
yes,
in the
it is
board
part of
packet.
it.
Yep, it's under,
It may not be there tonight because we had some problems with the size of it on putting it on the computer, but it is in the public packet.
Okay, thank you.
I saw it.
Alan, I was just curious, what is driving the 6.5% increase in local revenue that I was noticing?
May I ask, was that in a particular page or a fund? The majority of that, I'm speculating, but I'm pretty confident in it, is the allocation of the property tax levy. So the property tax cap formula deals with things in the aggregate. We have the latitude to allocate that to the individual funds. And then as I work on the 5-year in the budget, as I notice if we're starting to draw down a fund balance or we have a deficit in a particular fund, in a given year, I may allocate more money there. And so, but see, when you get down, that's a pretty granular level of analysis, and you can see some really strange anomalies like that jump out at you. So sometimes you have to get back up at a higher level. But that was a good question because it gave me a chance to explain that. So thank you.
Alan, what's the reserve percentage going to be at the end of the budget, just out of curiosity?
That's in the 5-year, and I don't have that in front of me tonight, but I'm going to say probably around the 12% range.
I think it's actually closer to 13.5 or 14%. Yeah, I think so.
So, and you as a district, the high school has a policy that be 10% of the operating expenditures. 67 does not. But that 10% range, I consider very, very healthy. Cash flow wise, it's very good. And so to be, if we're at 13.5, that's very good, especially given where we've just come from.
And knowing what's coming next year with the abatement
Exactly,
expenditures.
exactly. That and the 10-year, yes.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Alan. May I have a motion to adopt the resolution to display the tentative budget?
So moved.
I have a second.
Second.
I have a roll call vote, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mr. Folker,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Anderson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is going to be removed from the agenda. So I believe I may have a motion to remove the Siemens contract renewal from the agenda.
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
Is this also a roll call? All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. The next item on the agenda is approval of food service fees. Is there a presentation on this? Mr. Simic.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. And there's been, last month, we had a food service update that Mrs. Hermes presented. One of the items that is historically in a presentation that's of that sort would be the inclusion of meal prices. And there is a modest increase recommended here, and I'll have Mr. Albus, if he would, walk us through that.
When we came to the district in 2006, the food service program was actually losing money. And in addition to losing money, there had been no investment in the equipment. Over the last several years, we've turned that around to where the food service program makes a little bit of money that can be reinvested back into the equipment. And Carol White and Jennifer have systematically gone through the buildings and have been trying to upgrade the equipment in the buildings. So doing that, though, is a conscious effort to try and make sure that we're covering our costs in the program or slightly exceeding the cost of operating the program. This past year, there were a number of enhancements made to the food service program. More organics, which cost more, less processed food, things like even the chicken tenders where they make them fresh daily and they bread them and they bake them. But there are costs associated with that. And so working with kind of backing into it, what is the increase necessary to maintain the threshold we've had. Jennifer and Quest had come up with the 50 cents, but also recognizing that there are a couple of components in that. It's not just the enhancements that have been put into place, but we haven't adjusted the food meal price in several years, and there is an inflationary component to food like there is to anything else. So Jennifer's cover memo attempts to cover both of those components and a recommended increase of 50 cents in the meal price for this coming year.
Alan, the 21 cents for continued program adjustments, that incorporates not only the increased costs of some of the value-added things we've asked Quest to do, but does that also take into account any equipment improvement or replacement or additions and things like that that might be required?
The equipment we've been covering through the annual increase. So yes, it would maintain the historical philosophy that we've put in place over the last few years. So it should cover our cost and provide a little bit of money that can be reinvested back in.
You know, I'm a little concerned about a 50-cent increase or a 14% increase. It seemed like Mrs. Hermes last month talked about the survey results, and I believe she pointed out that less than 50% of the parents said that they would be supportive of a 50-cent to $1 increase in the price. And my concern is this may, especially in these tough economic times, may be hitting a threshold. I understand the need to cover our costs. Certainly we want to be sensitive to that. But it feels like an awfully big increase, particularly if we are going to go through the process of sort of articulating and perhaps redefining what we're really looking for from our food service program. I'm not sure we're completely focused on the things that parents said they wanted, and I would imagine the people who are most willing to pay more for their food service product would be some of the people who are looking for healthier options. And for example, I know the gentleman from Quest, the owner of Quest, mentioned they changed the rib sandwich, but they haven't changed the barbecue sauce on it, which is a real stickler point for some of those more vocal parents because of the high fructose corn syrup being the first ingredient on the product. So my concern is we may be pricing ourselves out of the marketplace for some parents and not fully addressing some of the concerns of those other parents.
I think we've had some internal discussions very similar, and I think we share the concerns because we looked at the survey results as well. The cost of some of the products, so the organics, and again, this isn't, you know, the fee structure with Quest is the cost of the product, and then they're paid a management fee. So they don't really have a lot of skin in the game on that end of it. But it's finding that balance between what is the right level of organic products or less processed food versus the cost associated with and what are people willing to pay. And I think that's going to take some more drilling down, because when we ask questions like, do you want healthier options, I think everybody would say yes. But do you want healthier options at $1 a meal more, or at 50 cents a meal more, or at a quarter more, is I think what we need to get down to. I think the recommendation here is to maintain some of the enhancements or changes that were made this past year that seem to have resonated, but recognizing there are costs with that, but also recognizing we haven't increased costs in several years as well.
I share some of the concerns Beth said as well. You actually touched on some of my concerns. I think we heard from the survey results that, if I remember correctly, 63% of the respondents were satisfied, leaving 37% unsatisfied. And I guess we had some question about maybe the validity of the statistical validity of that information. I'm a little bit concerned that the 50% price increase is, 50 cents price increase is sort of making no one happy. It's not making the price conscious folks happy, and the healthy food alternative folks is not doing enough for them. So I kind of, you addressed it a little bit, that we need to understand more truly what the information is, what the price points are. But I'm a little concerned that it's going to be, it's not really doing much for either of the groups. I'm not sure.
Just to frame where we are, what I read and what I think I heard you say is the 50-cent increase is necessary to break even with changes that have already been made? Or does it cover new improvements to food quality and equipment?
It's my belief.
You know what I'm saying is a
looking at
distinction?
Mike for some direction as well, but I believe it's to sustain the changes that were put in last year.
That's the way I read it, so I'm just trying to frame what we're looking at this evening. And if our goal is to break even and we don't want to subsidize the meal program with education funds, we're not, there is no argument about do people want better food, more organic food, higher quality food, do we need new equipment? These are changes that have already been put in place, and what we're really talking about is, are we willing to subsidize a negative balance, or do we want to raise the price because we want to break even on this program? It's a whole nother issue about talking about what do we want the food service to look like going forward, and I think we talked about that a little bit earlier. So I just want to simplify what we're really looking at with this issue.
I'm not sure that this is completely clear in the memo, and perhaps we need to table this to get more clarification on this. I also am a little concerned about something I heard in last month's presentation, where the owner of Quest said, you know, if we want a nitrate-free hot dog, that's going to be a 4-time increase. I realize food service prices are not the same as consumer prices, but when I go to the grocery store, I pay about 5% more for a nitrate-free hot dog. So to me, there's a world of difference between a 5% increase and a 400% increase. I'm not sure this is completely clear in terms of what our parents would be getting for that 50%, or 50 cents, sorry, I keep saying that, 50-cent increase. I mean, part of it is based on, you know, the CPI, taking the 3-year CPI, that gets us to the 29 cent. If we just take what's projected for 2013, we'd be at about 10-cent increase. And then the 21 cents is for, quote, continued program adjustments, but I'm not sure that's fully articulated in terms of what those are. I'm just concerned about going up to $4. It seems like a high price point for a child's lunch.
Is there, to address those concerns, because this hasn't been, well, the last time they increased prices, did you say is 3 years ago?
The memo says 11, 12.
Can we anticipate that that would be moving forward? Or no, with our enhancements, is this going to be, do we foresee this being an annual thing, or that's to be determined?
Well, I think it's to be determined on several factors, what we would define as what we want the program to be, but also what happens with cost of food. Food, I believe, is impacted with fuel costs. You know, so if fuel costs go up, you know, the CPI on food goes up and our costs go up.
And I think anyone at this table who grocery shops can say in the past year our groceries have been much higher. Anybody? I think they have. So this was not surprising to me at all when it came across. Plus, I know that we're not necessarily where we want to be, and that there are still things that parents are wanting that they are articulating. But we've made strides that we heard about in this presentation, big strides, I consider, in the past year that I think warrant a cost increase.
This helps illustrate, I think, the whole issue, and it's about, my comment earlier about it's too big a spectrum to try and satisfy everybody. We're not going to be able to do it because we can't provide all the organics and all the healthy food choices at a very low cost point unless philosophically we're willing to subsidize it. So it's finding that balance, and I don't know what that balance is yet. That's going to take a lot of discussion.
If I could, one thing that's sometimes seen in school lunches is a little bit counterintuitive, but that's as you improve quality and even if you raise prices, participation actually goes up. And that was the case when they made the changes in 2008. There's a lot of similar concerns, but actually more people buy lunch now than they did before they improved quality. And is there a limit to that? Of course, if we were charging $11, participation might go down. But we don't really know whether 50-cent increase is going to increase participation or not. Evidence is, I would say, mixed on that. Just from a standpoint of planning, this is the last meeting before the school year starts, and so I guess my thought is one way, I understand wanting to table and get more information. One thought would be, let's just vote, whatever we vote, yes or no, so that at least they know what kind of food to order when school opens.
I have 2 questions, Alan. First, do you know what the price was back in 2010-11?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Somebody else might at the table. Like when we went up to $3, what was it before that? Was it $2.50? Was it? Okay. Second question, I guess it gets back to what Bill just said and what Rick said, though. How does the contract work? So suppose we raise the price to $4 and everyone keeps eating, versus if we raise the price to $4 and very, very few people eat. Do we bear that risk, or does Quest bear that risk? We do, right?
I'm pinch hitting on this, so I believe we do. I believe the contract is structured where it's the cost of the program, and we have input on the staffing levels. I believe if it's like our GCA contract, may even have some input on the range of salaries, which we sometimes do to maintain continuity of staff. So the cost of the program, we have a lot of influence over, and then we pay a management fee. Now, a couple of years ago, if I remember right, we did talk about some incentives with Quest, and I'm not sure where we landed on that, whether we just contemplated that, restructuring it. But I believe the main components are the cost of the program, and then there's a management fee on top of it. So the raising of the cost of the meal is really to cover the expenses.
Can I ask?
Rob, you're getting into how much of the expenses are fixed versus variable.
Well, I
If
think
you're
that's
talking
actually the
about-
big.
'cause there's not a direct correlation between how many eat in the program and profitability. Some of the expenses are variable at least, but I think the answer is we do, but we take the profit or the loss. That's the bottom line.
I think it's very likely that if we raise it to $4 and people just stop eating, the fixed costs of this program are huge, and we're going to eat that. If we raise it to $4 and very few people change their pattern, then it's probably a break even. But the point is, $4 is not obviously the break even point. It's sort of Jen's best guess at the break even point.
And if we did not do this, do we have a projected loss? I'm kind of going back to Rick's comment of what we're voting on. We're voting to break even. What would our loss be if we don't do this?
I don't in my head tonight, but we could calculate that very quickly.
I would imagine if we stick with our current cost structure, that Quest would then work to manage to that cost structure. That might mean making some changes that they want, not making some changes or continuing with some changes that perhaps they had on the docket to make. But since we are the ones that tell them what to buy, I would imagine that they would manage to our cost structure. And I just to be clear, I'm not opposed to a price increase. I am opposed to the magnitude of the price increase.
But if it costs 50 cents and we don't want to subsidize, then I don't. Well, if there's a different issue, that's a different issue, though. I understand what you're saying, but
I don't think they manage it to break even. I think they do
they
what we
manage
tell
our
them to do.
expectations. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I think if we tell them this is what we want for our food choices, and the revenue doesn't cover the costs, we have a shortfall. They don't manage to a break even. I don't think so.
I feel like we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We're trying to do the work of the committee we just got done talking about. We wanted to put in place this year to talk about next year. So if this is what we think it takes to stay at a break-even pace versus with the changes that have already been put in place as well as the inflation, that's the number. If we think that's a little too high and we're willing to take that risk and potentially subsidize a little bit of it, then we could have a discussion about that. But it looks like this is the number, and then we use the committee that we've just agreed that we want to have
If
over
I
the
may
next
offer
year
too,
to determine if these changes need to be kept in place, and if not, the price will go down.
I think you summarized very well. It's the number, or we could subsidize, or the middle ground might be to pick a number and let Jennifer and Quest come back with, I think what you were alluding to is, what would we take out then? What would we back off from to kind of manage to that number? So if 50 cents is too high, but 35 is not, then what changes would be necessary to make that occur?
Alan, this may be unfair to you because you're not Jen, but do you know, did we do any price elasticity analysis?
I don't know.
What, if I may, one of the things that I think would be problematic, would send a mixed message to Quest, is that we've had really a lot of input from is we have ongoing meetings with parents. You know, each school has parent input opportunities, and then we meet. One of the things that where we don't want to wind up is saying, okay, we've made a number of improvements that were, you know, really quite discussed at quite some length, and that have been well received and effectively implemented, and then to back off on the quality of those. I think on balance, it would be better to risk potential loss of participation than it would be to say, okay, now we're going to back off on the quality of our offerings. As much as I see 50 cents as being, you know, I have the same reservations about whether or not we're going to limit participation in there. I don't. Is there any way that we can satisfy both issues here to maintain the quality but not wind up at 50 cents that you're aware of? Because I mean, one of the things that we did is, you know, we've got things baked on site now on a daily basis with, you know, breaded, it's not deep fried, and so on. And, you know, it's gone well. And, you know, these are changes that were, you know, processed significantly, no pun intended, through various groups. So
That goes back to
organically
my,
processed.
that goes back to my question. If we're talking about this price increase is necessary to cover the costs of the improvements we already put in place, I don't know how we vote against it. If it's for some kind of slush fund for future improvements, it's a different case. But if these are improvements we've already got in place, we're going to have to back them out, as you're referring to. And I don't see us doing that.
Just to clarify, there are no slush funds.
And no slushy funds on this food program.
Other comments from board members or the public or Alan? All right. Well, may I have a motion to approve the food service fees?
So moved.
May I have
Second.
a second? May I have a roll call vote?
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson,
No.
Mr. Anderson,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mr. Folker.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the approval of Board Policy 2.150, update, first reading. Mr. Borkowski.
All right, this is the policy update that we discussed in the policy committee report. I'm pulling it up on my screen to read it to you, but it is adding number 7 and number 8 to the standing committee list in section 2.150, naming the audit committee and the compensation committee as standing committees.
Is there discussion?
I just want to clarify a question that Bill asked. Are we talking about 2 committee or board members on each of these standing committees?
What we talked about in the committee, so I'm going to answer your question, but preface it. I don't believe that the policy committee defines the number or the people on the committee. I think that's the job of the board president. The policy, our board policy manual says you may have up to 3 committee members on any committee, which the board president appoints. What we talked about during our discussion was 2 board members on the audit committee and 2 board members on the compensation committee. They are 2 separate committees we're talking about.
And these committees, do you also have community members, or do you work alongside administration?
So one of the points that we discussed at the policy committee was the general lack of clarity on purpose, scope, structure of the committees, which is defined or not defined in this section. So for example, number 4, finance and operations, it doesn't actually give any definition as to the purpose or the makeup. The committee chair and the committee sort of define that. The policy committee took an action item that we're going to review what currently exists. So there is a committee charter that some of the committees have that speak to the purpose, that speak to the structure. So the policy committee is going to look at those, see that they're up to date, and if they're not, develop a template and send them to each of the committee chairs, to Leslie and to Rick, to update accordingly. If we create these two committees tonight, then once the board president, Bill, assigns the members, then those members would define the committee charter, the makeup, the structure, but we didn't feel that the policy committee should be defining the makeup.
But Mike, let me clarify one thing. All we're doing tonight is approving the first reading.
Correct.
So
That's a great point.
we're not approving these committees be added to policy. What we're saying is we've got to get the first reading out of the way. We're doing that tonight. By our September next policy meeting, we will, and prior to the next board meeting, flesh out the specifics that you're talking about, because they need to be fleshed out. That was one of the questions I raised in the meeting, was how much do we need to bring to the first reading? And it was just the recommendation of where we want to head, but the details need to be provided to the board prior to the second reading so that we can actually approve the committees and the policy at that time.
Well said, Jeff. Thank you. May I have a motion to approve the Board Policy 2.150 update first reading? The second reading will take place at the September board meeting.
So moved?
Second?
Second?
May I have a roll call vote, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson,
Aye.
Mr. Anderson,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Folker.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item is approval release of executive session minutes for December 12th through December 13th. May I have a motion to approve the release of executive session minutes as discussed in executive session?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Folker,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Anderson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is going to be removed. May I have a motion to remove the discipline of a tenured teacher from the agenda?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
Roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mr. Anderson,
Aye.
Mr. Folker,
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item is approval of Human Resources report. Mr. Simic?
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I recommend that the Human Resources report be approved as presented.
May I have a motion to approve the Human Resources report as presented?
So moved.
Second?
Roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson,
Aye.
Mr. Anderson,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mr. Folker.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item is approval of consent agenda items, which include disbursements, payrolls, and financial statements from June 2013, minutes of an executive session, June 18, 2013, minutes of a regular meeting, June 18, 2013, minutes of an executive session, July 9, 2013, minutes of a special meeting, July 9, 2013, and disposal of audio recordings, December 13, 2011. May I have a motion to approve the excuse me, are there any items in this agenda that a board member would like to remove and discuss separately? Hearing none. May I have a motion to approve the consent agenda items as presented?
So moved?
Second?
Second.
May I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Anderson,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson,
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski,
Aye.
Mr. Lemke,
Aye.
Mr. Folker.
Aye.
Motion carries.
We have two FOIA requests for District 67. Mr. Aaron Neff of School Wires, Inc., Laura Rukavina. Announcements. Monday, August 19th is Deer Path Middle School New Family Orientation at 9 a.m. Friday, August 23rd, 5th grade orientation, 8 a.m. Monday and Tuesday, August 26 and 27 are institute days with no students attending. Wednesday, August 28th, first day of school, which is now a full day of school for grades 1 through 8. Friday, September 6th, kindergarten, first regular day of school. The next District 67 Board of Education meeting is scheduled for September 24th, 2013 at 7 p.m. at Lake Forest West Campus in the boardroom. The next item on the agenda is adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn the meeting of the Lake Forest District 67 Board of Education?
So moved.
And may
Second.
I have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed? The meeting is adjourned. I would like to call to order the City of Lake Forest District 67 Board of Education meeting for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2013. May I have a roll call vote? Madam Clerk.
Mr. Anderson?
Present.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Schuler?
Here.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Here.
Mr. Borkowski?
Here.
Mr. Lemke?
Here.
Mr. Folker?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. The first order of business is the President's report. I'm very pleased with the performance so far of our new board members. As a group, they have been really without exception respectful, energetic, ethical, open-minded, and eager to learn. And I commend Mike Simic and his team for devoting substantial time towards making their orientation a success. One of the challenges of serving on a board of education is that there's often substantial disagreement about what the role of the board should be. As anyone familiar with organizational behavior can tell you, it's hard for a group to be effective if there's not substantial buy-in about the nature and scope of the overall mission. These challenges may arise from a number of factors, and everyone may be at some point bear some responsibility. It's clear that two proper roles for a board of education are: one, developing a vision for the district, and two, maintaining oversight of the operations of the district. Importantly, both of these roles can only be performed by the board. The district cannot properly develop a vision on its own, as it is ultimately funded by the community for the education of the community's children. And the district can also not be charged with its own oversight, as there's an obvious conflict of interest. I'd like to speak briefly about each of these areas. Vision. Everyone agrees that this function belongs at the board level. It is through the process of developing a vision that our community's shared values can most effectively be incorporated into our students' education. Do we want to educate students who are competitive internationally in math and science? Do we want to educate students who are responsible citizens who contribute to their communities? Do we want to educate students who are confident enough to take risks and start new companies or other organizations? While it's tempting to answer all of the above to such questions, the relative importance we place on each of them has important implications for the sort of academic curriculum we offer and the values and skills we seek to instill in our students. With a new superintendent and substantial turnover on the board, this is a great time to focus on the mission, vision, and goals of the district. Oversight. Conflict between a board of education and a school district is often related to the oversight function of the board. It'd be very valuable to have a good definition of the oversight role so this function could be as productive and efficient as possible. One important key to understanding the oversight function is the role of policy. In general, the oversight function of the board means that it has a legal responsibility to ensure the district has policies in place which allow the district to successfully carry out its educational mission, to be responsible with public funds, and to ensure there is a means for monitoring and verifying that these policies are followed. The policies should be written, transparent, and clear, and they should be reviewed regularly, and board members should be familiar with them. Responsibility for carrying out these policies is not the job of the board, and board members must refrain from involving themselves in the implementation of policy, as this can undermine the work of district employees. Our district employs highly trained educational professionals who need latitude to do their jobs as they see fit. Similarly, the district must also give the board the needed freedom to perform its legally mandated functions. Based on my experience serving on this board, I'm confident that both the board and administration will act in good faith and are capable of a self-reflective and honest appraisal of their proper roles. I know I speak for all board members in saying that we look forward to working with Mr. Simic and the district to continue building an effective board-district relationship which will serve all of our important constituencies. That concludes the formal part of the President's report. In addition, what we wanted to do this evening was get feedback from board members on the discussion we had at last month's meeting regarding food service. And we actually haven't done this sort of thing before, but we're really going to sort of go down the line, and for people who were here and have anything that they'd like to comment on, I think it'd be a good time to do that. One sort of issue at hand is that it's been 6 years since we've had a new food service provider, and well, I think reasonable people could disagree on this. One thought is that it might be a good time to go ahead and look for someone else to work, at least rebid the process, the contract for food service. So I'm going to start on the left and ask Mike Borkowski if he has any thoughts on this matter.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for that introduction, as well as the opportunity to do this informal polling of us. We did talk about this at the last Board of Ed meeting, and I'll kind of reiterate my thoughts. I think that 6 years is a long time, and it is time to rebid the service part of the contract. One of the things that I learned at the last board meeting was that we as a district actually define the program versus the food supplier. I didn't quite understand that. So I think equally important, part one is that it is time to rebid simply because it's been a long time. But equally important, I think, is that it's time to have the district, have the community, with the administration's involvement, the board's involvement, the community, the parents' involvement, redefine what the program actually is. Nutrition and